scene on Tuesday night and when he was involved with a shootout with police. Dozens of officers, including members of the elite raid force, that's the RAAD force, they've cordoned off an area. This is in southern Strasbourg. This is the area of Neudorf in Strasbourg, and that operation, as you can see, very much ongoing with that street cordoned off. And as I say, this is yards from where that gunman was last seen. We'll keep an eye on events in Strasbourg, and if there is a development, I'll take you straight back. But let's return to events much closer to home, much closer to here, in fact, here in Westminster, because the Prime Minister has confirmed this morning that she won't lead her party into the next election. It now seems the so-called meaningful vote for MPs on her Brexit deal is unlikely to be held next week, though it will happen before January the 21st. Tensions are still running high within the Conservative Party after last night's vote of confidence, as our political correspondent Ian Watson now reports.
The morning after the night before at Westminster, not exactly a new dawn for the Prime Minister. The vote of confidence was, if not disastrous, certainly disappointing, with more than a third of her MPs wanting her to go. She confirmed today that she had to promise not to lead her party into another election. Her focus now was on her deal.
What I'm clear about is the next general election is in 2022, and I think it's right that another party leader takes us into that general election. My focus now is on ensuring that I can get those assurances that we need to get this deal over the line.
And the main issue, just in case you don't know by now, is the backstop, staying close to EU rules to avoid a hard border in Ireland. Her critics, even some of her cabinet, believe she needs a legally watertight assurance that it's temporary. This morning, ministers were hopeful of progress.
I wish her every success today in making sure that she delivers on the questions that some of my colleagues have had about the backstop.
We have a period of time now, following the vote last night, for the Prime Minister to have those discussions with European colleagues. And I think we saw in the language that was reported last night that there is some movement.
But this former Conservative leader doesn't think there's been nearly enough. He says the EU needs the smack of firm government.
What's on offer is what she forces the EU to face up to. We don't want to hear any more about the fact that the EU won't, the EU won't, the EU won't. What we want to know is, what does the UK government genuinely think that it's prepared to do? Are you prepared to leave the table? Are you prepared to take the 39 billion off the table? Are you prepared to say to the EU, for God's sake, you are the ones that will not compromise? We have compromised all the way through.
And he warns Theresa May that without significant changes, Northern Ireland's DUP could force her from office.
We may face confidence in the House. How can we rely on the DUP, all of them, to support us when they are so fundamentally offside on this agreement?
Well, Theresa May has gone to Brussels, but she leaves behind a divided party. Her Chancellor has talked about flushing out extremists. A former leader has said that that kind of talk could be the end of the party as we know it. And a current minister has said, after the apocalypse, all that will be left are ants and Tory MPs complaining about Europe and their leader. The tall order for Theresa May is that she must heal those divisions in little more than a month. MPs will vote on her revised deal on or before the 21st of January. If it's rejected, she has until the 11th of February to rethink. That doesn't leave much time for the EU Parliament to give its approval, as we're due to leave the EU by the end of March. Theresa May now needs to build bridges with her own backbenchers, and she'll be reflecting on the fact that it's easier to win a vote of confidence than to win approval for her deal at Westminster. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Well, with me now is Nikki Da Costa, who was until last month Director of Legislative Affairs at Number 10. She was responsible for pushing through Brexit and other legislation in Parliament until she left the role then. And this is your first time on television, so doubly welcome. Just behind the scenes, presumably you're working, or were working, and the team still is working on the basis that if she gets the bill through, there's an awful lot of work to be done. How does it work behind the scenes? What's going on?
So I guess the key thing is that this is, we talk about the Whitehall machine, and what that means is actually there are many moving parts. So, in terms of the vote itself, you've got the Whip's office, you've got the Number 10 operation, but you'll also have people in DEXU and Cabinet Office supporting that, and then you've got the bill itself. So there's a lot of people contributing their expertise, their different experiences, in order to ensure that when it actually happens, it can go as fast as it possibly can and smoothly.
And at any time, presumably, when you know there's a ballot about to be a vote in this place, you've got to be ready to get it going, because it's one thing having the vote, but getting the legislation is a different thing, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and you know, when you're preparing a piece of legislation for Parliament, you kind of know its weak spots. You want to think about where are people going to focus on, where are you going to have difficulties as the bill progresses, and you're thinking about, okay, what can we do to prepare for that? What might we want to do to offer as a concession? How might you want to build a bit of support around that particular aspect of the bill?
And how complicated is that when we're talking about a government with no majority, depending on other parties? That must be very difficult.
Yes, but very intellectually stimulating. You know, you're thinking about where are the different groups in Parliament, what are the things that they've already said are going to be of interest to them, and you're trying to think through. We talk about a two-house strategy, so you can never think about it as just, you know, what do you do at this particular stage. You need to think about what happens if you do this here, and then when it gets to the next stage of the bill, and then what happens when it goes into the Lords. So you'll always want to think about what do you do now, and how do you build on that as you go through.
So what we know at the moment is next week it's not happening.
Yep.
So there'll be a sense of relief, I guess, in your former colleagues right now.
I think so, but sort of tense. You know, you're thinking about how do we gear up, and I imagine Christmas is still going to be relatively busy.
And then there's the 21st.
Yes.
By which date?
Yes.
If she gets this through, then the real work begins, and that's without the fear of amendments or whatever else might be thrown in.
Yes, so I think you're probably going to see it. My hunch is the week commencing the 14th of January, you'll probably see the vote, and then you'll see the bill, in sort of the terminology, walked in on the back of it.
Well, I just want to pick, you say the week of the 14th.
Yes.
What do you say that on the basis that the Prime Minister will know about these time difficulties, the clock is ticking, and that would be the advice she'd be getting, try and get for that sort of time?
Well, I think there's sort of a grey areas emerge, because the 21st of January is a date that's come to the fore because it's in the legislation, but it's only in the legislation for a no-deal scenario in which there's not been a deal. Right now we actually have a deal. It's not been approved by Parliament, but there is a deal. Yet the 21st of January has become something of political salience, so that the PM has said on the 21st of January, by the 21st we'll do something. 21st is a Monday. Now, we know that there's going to have to be some days of debate in the House before you have that vote. So that's why I think things are going to kick off in the week before.
And let's talk amendments, because we know that, well, there'll be at least one, do we?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I imagine you'll see a very similar business motion as you had before, which is basically up to six amendments, which the Speaker will select from. And some of the ones I think you can predict, I think that you'll see Hilary Benz go down again, and what his says is essentially, we don't like the deal, we don't like no deal, and we kind of want to tell you what you should do now. You'll probably see a second referendum amendment. Well, that's if the different warring parties on the referendum side can decide what their strategy is. The Lib Dems got their knuckles wrapped for putting down an amendment this time. And you'll probably see an official opposition amendment, probably something from the SNP. And who knows, I would expect a government will also table its own, well, it won't be it'll be in the name of a backbencher, something to offer concessions with.
And, I mean, you're working very closely, obviously, with Number 10. You weren't there the last week, but you won't be unused to senses of crises, I would imagine. What's that like?
So I think it's, you know, when I first walked through that door, there was a sense of like, oh my God, I'm in Number 10. And I think you get those learning moments every time you go through a crisis. And so there'll be the teams that are really involved in it, the senior team and different parts of the building. But remember, there's 250 people in Number 10. That facade conceals an awful lot. And so if you're not part of that initial action, sometimes you're watching Twitter and we're watching what the journalists are doing, going, oh, that's interesting. Or you might be sort of just walking around the building going, where are we, you know, how are things? And I imagine a lot of that would have been going on for quite a lot of the building yesterday.
Into the evening.
Well, into the evening.
And whilst there may be a slight sigh of relief, as we were saying, that Christmas isn't cancelled, how will they be preparing? Because, well, possibly the week after Christmas, but certainly the first couple of weeks of January, it's going to be pretty hectic.
So I think one of the upsides about what has happened is that actually you've kind of had a dry run. So there are lessons to be learned from this experience, how you might talk to Parliament, how you might engage. And all of that should be filtering into that process of them thinking, OK, when we do get this back from the EU, when we know we've got something more to offer Parliament, how do we approach it? And I think that there'll be a lot of engagement over Christmas. number 10 as to how you do it.
But when you live and breathe it, as you have been, you will know better than most when Theresa May comes back or when she speaks in Brussels tonight and says, I've got this.
Yes.
You will instinctively know or have a rough idea whether that's going to be accepted or not.
Yes, I think people do have a gut instinct, and you know, but then a lot of it is also unpacking it, because this is quite complicated stuff. And you know, just like the ordinary person in the street, you've kind of got to go, okay, you know, you kind of got to explain it, and you seek other people's advice as well, and go from there.
You're missing it.
You will always miss it. Number 10 is an amazing place to be, and it's an amazing team. So yeah, you will always miss it.
Nikki DaCosta, thank you very much. Thank you. Your first television interview here on BBC News. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching BBC News with me, Simon McCoy. Now, to other news. Beds in England's hospitals were almost full last week and not far off levels reached at the height of last winter during the flu outbreak. Let's get more from our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Well, that's right, Simon. The issue is we haven't had any really cold weather, there hasn't been any flu, and bed occupancy levels are pretty high, above 94% in English hospitals last week. About similar to this time last year, but remember what happened last year. The winter then kicked in and occupancy levels rose even from there. We had all those problems. We've also learned last week there were 1 in 10 hospitals were fully occupied, every bed occupied on at least one day during the week. We've also had A&E figures across the system in England for November showing that 95% target was missed again. The percentage waiting to be treated, dealt with or assessed over that time fell to 87.6%. That was the low earlier this year in March, and below Scotland, although ahead of Wales and Northern Ireland. So people are saying this is very early days. It's a bit of a pointer to pressure which is likely to come across the system over the whole winter.
So what are the NHS doing about this, Hugh?
Well, NHS England have said that if you look at the numbers of patients being treated, they are higher than last year. There are more people who are being seen in A&E units. There are stats showing that the numbers who go into hospital and out again on the same day, having been treated, admitted and then discharged, is higher than before. So they are a lot busier, staff are working a lot harder, but they are doing the best they can in the circumstances. The government says it's invested more in A&E facilities in England to help out there. But it's being pointed out by others that you can invest more money at the last minute for winter, but you can't buy in new staff, and that remains one of the major problems. Vacancies in the workforce, particularly nursing, unfilled, which points to worries at management level at NHS trusts over the next few months. So people are saying it could yet be even more difficult than last winter.
Hugh Pym there, our health editor. Of course, so much depends on what the weather does, and we're about to find out that there is a change coming. With the details, here's Stab Danaos.
Hello there. It has been a cold day up and down the country, particularly when you factor in the ice.
Other news, the government announces a 2.8% rise in funding for councils in England. And hospital beds in England were almost full last week, with the usual winter pressures still to come. Well, let's talk sport now, because I'm certainly not going to take part in any. Let's go to Catherine Downs, who's at the BBC Sports Centre. Catherine.
Maybe a bit of vigorous movement would warm you up a little bit, Simon, perhaps. The FA has announced that Martin Glenn has resigned from his position as Chief Executive Officer and will step down at the end of the season. Under his tenure, England's men and women have both reached the semi-finals of the World Cup. The under-17s and under-20s are both world champions, and revenue at the FA has also increased by 40%. But he's also faced criticism during his time at the FA over issues such as the appointment and dismissal of Sam Allardyce as England manager and the failed sale of Wembley Stadium.
The FA has said that Martin Glenn delivered on much of what he came to do when he joined in 2015, and also that he leaves a very strong foundations for his successor. So they clearly feel that the time is right for him to move on. Many chief executives come and go in any industry, and the FA will now be looking for a new one. But perhaps the warning signs were here in March when reports suggested they had recruited headhunters to look for Glenn's replacement if he was to resign after the World Cup. He didn't, but he is now, and that hunt begins or is stepped up immediately.
Manchester United manager Jose Mourinho has criticised his starting lineup after their defeat by Valencia in their final Champions League group match. Phil Jones scored a rather embarrassing own goal as they lost 2-1. United had already qualified for the knockout phase but missed out on topping their group after Juventus lost at Young Boys. Mourinho was frustrated he had to use his subs to improve the side.
My team improved really when I made the changes that I didn't want to make, which is a little bit of frustration because I didn't want to play the 3 players that I played in the second half.
The Women's Tennis Association has announced increased protection for mothers returning to the tour. From next season, players coming back after childbirth or injury will be able to use their previous ranking to enter 12 tournaments over a 3-year period. But Serena Williams' wish that returning mothers should also be seeded in line with their ranking has not been granted. Justin Rose has a chance to make a great season even better this week. He's defending his title at the Indonesian Masters in Jakarta, and he was just 1 shot off the pace on 5 under par when play was interrupted by bad weather towards the end of the first round. Well, Rose can end the year as world #1 with a top 12 finish here, and he's playing alongside another of the victorious European Ryder Cup team and his good friend, Henrik Stenson. England now know who they'll face in the semi-finals of the Hockey World Cup. It'll be Olympic silver medalist Belgium on Saturday after they beat Germany 2-1. The winner coming in the final quarter. England have already beaten the Olympic champions Argentina on their way to their 3rd consecutive World Cup semi-final. Swimming's international governing body has announced a new competition for next year in response to criticism from some of the sport's top names. Olympic champion Adam Peaty stated last week that swimming was stuck in the 1970s after FINA forced the cancellation of a new rival event he was backing. FINA hopes the new format, known as the FEMA Champions Swim those who have voiced frustrations with its governance recently. But BBC Sport understands that over 30 of the world's best swimmers will meet in London next week to discuss taking further action against the organisation. That is all the sport from me for now. Here on BBC News, it's time for Ask This.
Well, the European Union leaders meeting here in Brussels right now to discuss Brexit. We're going to be taking your questions right now about the deal that Theresa May has managed to get with the EU and that she's trying to get through Parliament. With me here in Brussels is our Brussels reporter Adam Fleming, and we also have Carmino Mortera Martinez from the Centre for European Reform, a senior research fellow there at the Centre for European Reform. So we've got quite a few questions. We're going to rattle right through them now. Let's start off with Maureen Bradbury from Warrington emailing to ask, if we leave without a deal, Adam, will we save that £39 billion that we're supposed to be paying? And, very easy question, what will happen to the Irish border?
So the £39 billion is known as the financial settlement. That's made up of obligations that the UK had as a member that it signed up to, plus 2 years for the transition period of where we pay the same as what our membership fees would be. So an argument about how much the UK would be legally on the hook for if it left without a deal. Some of that £39 billion, we think, but it would not be paying 2 years of membership for the transition period, because if there's no deal, there's no transition period. If there is no deal, what happens to the Irish border? That's a massive question. The UK says there'd be no infrastructure on the Irish border, but Ireland also said there'd be no infrastructure on the Irish border. So what would the rest of the EU do about the fact that there would basically be an open door into the single market with no one keeping an eye on the door? An incredibly controversial question that you don't like asking here.
All right, let's go to the next question. This one's for Carmino then, from the Centre for European Reform. And this question is, the EU insists that to preserve the integrity of the single market, this requires a hard border. So what checks, procedures and other mechanisms must this hard border have to preserve the integrity of the single market? That is a question from Dr. Stephen Evans. Carmino, what would you say to that?
Right, so I'm not sure that the EU insists that there needs to be a hard border because of the integrity of the single market. I think it's just a consequence of what we understand as the four freedoms: freedom of movement of capitals, persons, services and goods. That you need to check goods and services, for what matter, if you decide that you're leaving the single market. So obviously the checks that will need to happen in between Northern Ireland and Ireland would be to ensure that the goods are travelling across the border are able to be lawfully marketed, as we say in Brussels, in both countries.
Okay, next question is for Adam from Francis Stelfox by email. Will the Prime Minister be able to get a date for the UK to leave the backstop? And the backstop really is what's being discussed here, Adam.
The simple answer is no, because the EU sees the backstop as the ultimate insurance policy for preventing a hard border being reintroduced with all those checks happening on the island of Ireland. And they say for an insurance policy, well, you can't have an end point, but you can have a situation in which it ends, which is when there's a future trade deal that deals with those problems so you don't need the backstop. Although, think about it, maybe you could have a date that you aspire for the backstop to not be needed. Now, does that count as a date, or is that not a date?
You need to be in that negotiating room. Jennifer Sutcliffe tweeting, how much has the process of leaving the European Union cost the British taxpayer? Camino, it's pretty hard to estimate. Can you give us a guess?
I am not often in the business of giving guesstimates when it comes to tax and economics, but I do know that ever since the Brexit process started, the British GDP has contracted by 2.5%. So that's an estimate, a proxy estimate at least.
All right, Adam, this one is from Enid Pratt via email. Wouldn't it be a good idea for the European Union to reform and also to have elected leaders?
That is an issue that they like to talk about a lot here, making the EU feel more democratic. Some people say it already is designed to be pretty democratic in that you have the national leaders here who are elected. You then have the European Commission, where there is a member from each member state appointed by the Prime Minister. So there's a democratic bit there. And then you've got the European Parliament, which is directly elected by the citizens. So in theory, that means you've got a bit of democracy at each bit, and there's loads of decisions that have to be made by unanimity here when the member states are meeting, or by qualified majority, where a majority of the countries representing a majority of the population agree to push something through. In terms of the big jobs, so President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, there's always perennially talk about, do you have a directly elected version of them? The closest they've got is called the Spitzenkandidat system, whereby the political group that wins the most seats in the European Parliament, their person gets to be President of the European Commission. It hasn't really worked.
Let me put the same question to Camino, because you're from the Centre for European Reform. Camino, wouldn't it be a good idea for the EU to reform? That's the question that we're asking you to answer.
Well, actually working for the Centre for European Reform, it would be weird for me to say no. I do think the European Union has some areas which need to be reformed, and that's something that we've been working on a lot, for example, Eurozone, migration and security policies and the like. However, I don't think that's necessarily fair to say that EU leaders are not elected. Just to recap, we have a Council of Ministers representing the governments of member states, all of whom, for as much as I know, have been elected by voters. We also have the European Parliament, as Adam was mentioning before. We now have a Spitzenkandidaten process, and there are many other ways in which the European Union is trying to input some more democratic legitimacy into it. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you. Len via email, Adam, is asking, can you please explain, under Theresa May's proposed deal, are we leaving the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, or not?
The ECJ will not have jurisdiction in the UK anymore, in that it mostly will not have a direct effect. Its rulings will not have a direct effect in the UK. However, that does not mean that the letters EC and J will disappear from national life. So, for example, on the citizens' rights part of the Brexit Treaty, so the rights of EU nationals living in the UK, they will have an 8-year period whereby they could bring cases to the ECJ concerning their rights in post-Brexit Britain. The ECJ will also have a role in some aspects of the financial settlement, so the Brexit Brexit bill, the UK's financial obligations, and if there's a dispute between the UK and the EU about how the Brexit treaty applies in the real world after it's been negotiated, that could, if it can't be solved by the two parties, go to an arbitration panel, and if the arbitration panel, which will be made up of independent figures, can't get to a solution, it could be referred to the European Court of Justice if a matter of European law is at stake.
Okay.
So ECJ is still involved.
All right. Ron Cromar has emailed, Camino, this is one for you. If the deal didn't go through, Theresa May's deal, and we ended up with WTO rules, trading rules, the World Trade Organization, would that solve the Irish border issue? That's the question from Ron Cromar.
Well, I'm afraid I'm not an expert on trade, but I assume the question of the Irish border is going to be there at least for the time in which we are not we don't necessarily have a framework in place yet. Since I was saying before, before the European Union and the UK can agree on a framework, there will need to be checks in between the two parties.
Okay, Camino. Last question. We've really rattled through them. Adam, this one I'm going to throw your way. We talk a lot about the Norway option, the Canada option. Now, this is a question from John Sinchak, I think that is pronounced. What are the barriers to the Canada option, to taking up the Canada option, and why can't that be negotiated?
So the first issue would be that if we did have a trade deal that was modelled on the one with Canada, you'd still have checks on goods crossing the border into the UK, which means you would have checks on the Irish border, unless you came up with some add-ons to the Canada deal that could reduce the checks that you would need down to zero, which would be quite tricky. Then, of course, there's the political barrier in the House of Commons, in that there are plenty of MPs who think a Norway-style, much closer relationship with the single market is what they would prefer, and they think Canada is too distant. And then you've got the issue of, would you have Canada in place for Great Britain, but you'd need the backstop for Northern Ireland to deal with the Irish border issues. Having said that, the political declaration, which sketches out the shape of the future relationship, is pretty Canada flavoured. It talks about two separate territories with their own rules and regulations and finding ways to bind those two together, but not in the way that you'd get with frictionless trade, which can only be achieved, the EU says, by staying in the single market and the customs union.
All right, a Canada-flavoured agreement.
Maple syrup.
Fantastic. Adam, thank you very much indeed. That's our Brussels reporter, and also many thanks to Camino Mortera-Martinez from the Centre for European Reform. Thank you both for asking our viewers questions on BBC Ask This. That's the latest from Brussels. Let's go back to Westminster and join Simon.
Well, I can't get over the Canada-flavoured agreement either. I've got no idea what you two were talking about just then. But anyway, you know what it's like. You've been here many times, and you see MPs walking past the whole time. That's one of the reasons we come here, is that chance to just grab people and talk to them. It looks a little more regimented there. What's it like? Can you get the chance to talk to people if you just see them across the room?
Well, in terms of leaders, that's quite hard, but you do actually doorstep them as they walk in, and actually you get all 28 leaders. They come in and they do what are called doorsteps. You have a chat with them. We were hearing from Theresa May, who looked, I have to say, well, pretty confident actually, and relieved after that vote of confidence, saying that she doesn't expect a breakthrough here, but she does make clear what she wants, which is some assurances, legal and political assurances, that will help get her Brexit deal through Parliament. Whether she's going to get them, we're going to have to wait and see. There's the dinner tonight where she will be, but at the end of that dinner, then she has to leave. Slightly awkward moment always. And the other 27, basically, without her in the room, start talking about Brexit, what they think they might be able to offer her. So we'll have to wait and see.
Ben, but will that be it then? At the end of today, we will know whether she has got something that's sellable here or not.
Well, maybe not at the end of today, the end of tomorrow, perhaps. I mean, we've already... What's really strange about these sort of summits is you get the draft conclusions leaked before the actual summit starts. So, in other words, before any of the leaders have actually got together in the room and discussed things. So things are already in place with square brackets around them, and included in that there's a 6-paragraph draft conclusion from this summit that we've already seen. It hasn't been signed off or confirmed, but it does offer some more reassurances, technical reassurances about the backstop that may or may not be enough for Theresa May. We'll have to wait and see.
Ben, I shall talk to you later. Thank you very much, Ben Brown in Brussels. Well, let's move to other stories here in the UK. And local authorities in England will be given the power to raise council taxes by an additional 3% next year. Announcing the annual funding settlement, the Community Secretary James Brokenshire said a brighter future lies ahead. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been following that story.
For the past 8 years or so, councils have had the amount of money they get from government cut back, and at the same time the demand for their essential services, particularly children's and adult social care, has been increasing. So this announcement was telling councils how much money they're going to get for the next financial year, which starts in April. And the Secretary of State said overall there'd be a 2.8% increase in core funding. Councils will also be able to increase council tax to help cover the cost of services by a maximum of 3%. And 15 council areas will try out a new scheme where they get to keep more business rates to help cover the cost of services too. The Secretary of State, James Brokenshire, said he understood the challenge councils faced. He wanted to make sure they get the resources they need. There is going to be a whole review of the way that councils are funded. But Labour said today's announcement falls short, that it's just shifting the burden from the government onto council taxpayers to cover the cost of their services. And the Local Government Association, which represents councils, said next year is going to be challenging. They were disappointed that the government didn't give councils more of the desperately needed resources, and there would be tough challenges when it comes to next year, with councils deciding what they can afford to provide.
Alex Forsyth reporting there. Let's catch up with all the business news now. We go to the cosy studio. Ben Bland.
Hear me, but you can't see me. Let me bring you the business news. The Brexit effect on bricks and mortar. The UK housing market slips to its weakest level in 6 years. The Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors says fewer people want to move and fewer want to sell because of the uncertainty around Brexit. It expects a further fall in house prices and the number of homes being sold in the next 3 months. More on this in a moment. The fashion chain Bon Marché says trading conditions on the high street are unprecedented and significantly worse than at the height of the financial crisis. It's warning that it could make a full-year loss of £4 million. Its shares fell sharply. The Yorkshire-based firm has about 300 stores around the UK, and the warning is the latest indication that the Christmas shopping period isn't living up to retailers' hopes. Sports Direct owner Mike Ashley's written a bluntly worded letter to the boss of Debenhams discussing his offer of a £40 million investment in the struggling department store chain. The letter, addressed to Sergio Boucher, suggests that without the money, the company, quote, has zero chance of survival. Mr. Ashley wrote that he was frustrated that Debenhams doesn't want his help. Right, sorry about the slight camera problems there, the slight gremlins in the system, but let us plough on now. And a question for you: how long do you think it takes for a property in the UK to sell? Well, on average, at the moment, it's 4 months. According to industry figures, buyers and sellers seem to be sitting tight, apparently waiting to see what happens with Brexit. So there are fewer homes coming onto the market. Generally, prices are falling as well, but the picture varies around the region. They're falling most notably in London, the South East and East Anglia. They're flat in the South West, East Midlands and North East. And prices seem to be still increasing in Northern Ireland, Scotland, the West Midlands, Wales, Yorkshire and the Humber and the North West. Give you a quick run around the regions there. Well, Lucian Cook is head of residential research at the property group Savills. Lucian, why do we think there is such variation, given if Brexit is the reason, it affects the whole of the UK?
Yeah, I think that really is a reflection of where different property markets are in the cycle. So the falls that we've seen in London, albeit quite modest, are really a reflection of how far house prices have moved in the period since 2005. And that just means that in those markets, buying a house is a much greater financial commitment. And therefore, when things become a little bit more uncertain, the buyers become that much more cautious.
Just going back to sort of basic principles of economics, that when something is in short supply, generally the price goes up. So if there are fewer houses coming onto the market, Why are people not seeing house prices rise?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the fact that at the same time the number of new buyer inquiries is down, so you don't have a massive disconnect between supply and demand in the market, and indeed we know the caution amongst buyers is reflected in the fact that since the Brexit vote, almost consistently we've seen new buyer inquiries tick down month by month, and that points to a market which becomes more confined to needs-based buyers, for example.
And I just wonder, you know, we had the warning from the Governor of the Bank of England not too long ago that a no-deal Brexit could hit house prices in the UK by as much as 30%. Does that tally with your estimates as well at Savills?
Well, I think you need to be quite careful